Okay. I'm going to talk about mobile Kotlin Multiplatform, which is essentially going to be using Kotlin to build multi-platform code for Android and iOS, right? So I think a lot of you do know who I am. If you do not, I am the president of a company called Touchlab. If you're like, what logo is that? We just rebranded. It's a long story. We also run the New York Android Developers Meetup. We're sort of kind of running Joy-Con. We used to directly, but we're doing the talk selection, yada, yada. And I kind of am involved in the other Kotlin Meetup, but we're speaking at this Kotlin Meetup because everybody, I don't know, we're all friends. So welcome to the Kotlin Meetup. It's great. So I'm just going to jump in. This started as like, hey, you needed another speaker, and I'm just going to demo what I'm working on. And then like the marketing people of the company, you know, which is like people, it's like 1, 2 people, but they're like, hey, talk about everything. So the talk expanded into context because out of context it was weird. So anyway, it's a Kotlin group, so I assume you're a little bit interested at least in Kotlin native. You've probably heard about this stuff, right? So I just kind of get out in front of, you know, why Kotlin multi-platform, right? And I published several blog posts about this recently. It's largely the same story as Doppel, which I'll explain very briefly in a minute. It's essentially, you know, the Android side is fully native. It integrates with existing projects very easily. And you know, you can do it in a piecemeal fashion. You can do some shared, a lot shared. It's low risk, and there's sort of a big community behind it, which is why we're really, like personally, I'm like obsessed with it, and I think as a company we're really into it, right? Because ultimately, even tonight, someone's like, yeah, we started doing a React Native thing, and essentially in the world of like, what are we going to do to not make 2 apps in the web? Good enough often trumps what everyone really kind of wants, and good enough right now is absolutely React. And it's not a dig on React, but you know, anyway, yada yada. Mobile needs a better answer when management says, hey, 2 apps and the web sucks. And right now just saying, hey, we're going to keep doing native is not necessarily going to always work, right? So, and also since this is a largely Google group, I'll get into it. You asked a very hilarious question on Twitter, which I was like, yeah, that person you asked that is probably not going to have a good answer. But it's not about this or Flutter, and I kind of get that a lot. I really don't consider them to be the same thing, right? Everything that isn't native to a native developer gets painted as, oh, that's cross-platform. And then they all are like this or that, but it's like the brush is way too big. That's what the picture's about. I've been thinking about this for a very long time in a lot of detail, right? And the conversation needs more nuance. There's the mono UI, there's the shared logic, there's shared architecture, and there's different implementations, and they have different pluses and minuses, and certainly different levels of competency, right? Like nobody talks about why Flutter or PhoneGap, even though they largely are the same thing in the same category, because that's bananas. But anyway, Flutter was pitched as a portable UI, which I think it's kind of how I think about it. It's like really amazing tech as a portable UI, but then either the community or the marketing folks decided in some quarters that it's the next big thing in mobile. And I think that it'll be very successful in some spaces. I don't think it's going to have full adoption or to be the next big thing. I think it needs to be easier to use as a portable UI, and rather than, you know, and like on top of what you're doing, rather than treating native as an exception, which is kind of what happens. It's a long story, yada yada. And I think that, well, anyway, blah blah blah. This isn't really about Flutter. So I kind of put this slide up there because it was like, hey, remember this? Write once, run anywhere. And I put this slide up there because everyone sees it, and they're like, oh yeah, what a failure that was. Except Java UI was kind of a failure. Java, as an example of like uniformity and sharing logic, was a success that you like really can't even calculate, right? So it depends how you look at it. And we kind of look at it from this story of like code interop, rather than like, hey, everything needs to be the same from a UI level. And that's where things are kind of different. Or I'm totally wrong. Like, we'll see how it goes. Like, predicting the future is not easy. But I wrote a blog post about this, which is kind of the view of what I'm thinking about the future. And it's kind of, the blue stuff is kind of Kotlin, and then the native stuff is whatever the color that's on top of it. And it's like being able to share a lot of core logic and but without having to adopt this entire other thing. So that's enough about the context. So Kotlin is for JVM, JS, and native. I am not going to talk about JS. Just, whatever. Personally, I'm kind of hoping WebAssembly really comes together faster, so we can have something else. So maybe you don't need to do JS for your web, but we'll see how that goes. It does technically work. You can output Kotlin native to WebAssembly, but let's not call that productive yet. But multi-threading is coming for WebAssembly, that kind of stuff. But that's a little further away. We're just going to talk about this. And it is, again, looking at it from one perspective, iOS and Android are super different. But if you really take it from the bottom up and look at how similar they are from that perspective, they're remarkably similar, because they're essentially the same thing under the hood and under the minus the specific notifications and how your button gets rendered, yada, yada. Okay, so if you were going to share Kotlin today with Kotlin Multiplatform, you totally could. This is what that would look like. You have a bunch of stuff in the Kotlin JVM, and you have kind of a bunch of stuff wrapped in iOS. I mean, you could write Kotlin iOS code. It's not, you wouldn't. And then that's the shared bit, because there's no essential libraries, right? Like there's no common networking thing. There's no real common threading thing. There's no like reactive thing. I mean, there are, but it's not really for Kotlin Multiplatform. It's for this specific. It's basically all for Java, right? And other stuff. And you kind of need all this stuff to have I would call it the minimum viable architectural ecosystem. So if you don't have these things, you're really going to have a hard time producing anything significant that's significantly sharing code, outside of like logic, maybe. So it's a lot of stuff, right? You got to build all these things. But on the plus side, it's not like we have to replay the history of the past decade of going through all of the ideas that we had about how to develop. We can just take a snapshot of where we're at. Like, this is the best library for this thing. That's the best library for that thing. A lot of it's already half Kotlin anyway in the Android world. It's just learning how to, make it fully Kotlin. And fully Kotlin, Kotlin Common, not Kotlin JVM. Anyway, also, if you've ever wanted to get involved in Android open source, or any open source, the last few years, I would imagine if you're just starting, Android feels very crowded. This is totally wide open, so it's a great time to start. In the developer community, the interest is really intense, and this is like super happening now. So if you've been following us or me, or you've been to the Meetup when I rant about this, Doppel. So I had a to-do in here, which I didn't actually to-do. But what is Doppel? It's essentially J2OBJC. We built a thing on top of it to share architecture between Android and iOS. And there's a bunch of libraries and all this kind of stuff. It works. It is not easy to come to a community with the Java thing after Google announced Kotlin was the new thing, because nobody really was like interested. So there is some stuff happening with it. There are some people actually using pieces of it. There's certainly a ton of J2OBJC stuff happening out in the world, but it's not sexy at all. Somebody talks about it, right? But internally, we have pretty much fully shifted to focusing on Kotlin Multiplatform as the future. So great. Why am I here, right? That was all preamble. SQLite. I am a big database nerd. I didn't actually write ORMLite, but ORMLite wouldn't be a thing on Android if I didn't write the adapter. So you're either welcome or I'm sorry, depending on how you look at it. And sort of a little history repeating itself, Kotlin Multiplatform needs a common SQLite interface, right? So we happen to have a iOS-compatible interface for SQLite that we built for this other thing. So that's what I'm working on, and I'm going to walk through the architecture, status, and plans, and that's what originally this talk was about, minus that whole context I just gave you. But here we go. It is absolutely a work in progress. Like I've literally been trying, like sitting down and actually trying to make this happen for like a few weeks. And a lot of that time was really just understanding how multi-platform works, and to some degree really understanding how Kotlin works above the, deeper than the Java person who thinks they understand how some of these things work, right? But the API is functional, and a little cleanup, maybe wrapping some more tests in there. It's going to stabilize pretty soon. So summertime, this is going to be less of a work in progress, right? So we're going to get more detailed here. This is how the Android SQLite stack works. And at the bottom, you've got this SQLite library, right, which exists on every device and every platform everywhere except like Firefox for some reason. Then on top of that, you've got the AOSP C++ code that talks to that. And on top of that, you have ASP Java code, which talks to the C++ through JNI. And that's the stuff you see when you do Android SQLite stuff, right? SQLite database, open helper, yada, yada. We got your code, and then we have the database facilitation libraries. We don't say ORMs anymore. So Room, DBFlow, SQLDelight, and all that kind of stuff. What we did on the Doppel side was just this. Took the AOSP C++, kind of sheared off some of the dependencies because it was insane. AOSP Java sheared out some of the stuff that didn't make sense, like content provider. Content provider usually doesn't make sense if you're using one, just FYI. And then you got your code and Room and DBFlow and SQLDelight, and all that's Objective-C made out of your Java. That's what we did. We didn't actually have DBFlow or SQLite, sorry, but I put them up there. We only used Room, so why make something you don't use? So, okay, anyway, this was my dream of what the Kotlin multi-platform thing would look like, right? So, you know, the Kotlin multi-platform defining an interface that looks a lot like the AOSP Java interface, and it just kind of delegates to that through the multi-platform stuff. And then you'd have this, and it would all work together nice and neat, and everything would look great. So we'll get back to that diagram in a bit. So J2OBJC, I fully understand how weird this sounds. You're taking Java to make Objective-C out of it. Both languages that are not what people want anything to do with these days, to put it that way. And I'll just extend this talk a bit. I was originally going to talk about J2OBJC and start the talk with explaining how these articles talk about someday we might eat insects as like one of our primary food sources. And a lot of it just has to do with getting past the mental side of it, right? In Java to Objective-C, you just have to get over it. But J2OBJC is used in an enormous number of, like, I won't say apps, but the size of distribution of apps, like iOS, Gmail, and Inbox, and Sheets, and all that stuff, a whole bunch of Google stuff. Square does actually put it in production now. You can see a talk by Ray Ryan. Not a lot. I'm not saying they're getting behind J2OBJC, but it's a real thing, and you can use it in production apps and it's stable. But obviously downsides. It's going to add a lot to your binary. If you're not careful, 10 megs. If you're really sipping it, like 5. And if you're building a large app out of it, that's not a big deal. But if you're adding 10 megs for one library, it's not great. So I had this idea, like, hey, the Kotlin JVM side's got all this Java stuff, and what sucks about Kotlin native, it doesn't have any of that stuff, but J2OBJC is essentially the JRE on iOS. Like, can't you just do this, and then, you know, we're all done, we can go home? And after playing with it for a while, it's like the uncanny valley of types. The output of J2OBJC works well with itself, and everything else, it just is maddeningly, like, not quite gonna work. And you could never, I mean, somebody could build a generic solution to do that, but nobody's going to. Don't even think about it. So this is, again, my dream diagram, and this is really what it looked like. So it's not to scale. Like, most of the heavy lifting still happening in here, but every little barrier, like, spoiler alert, if you get a blob out of a cursor, it copies it 4 times because the type system's so weird. That's only today. That is definitely going to change, right? So, yeah, anyway, blah, 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 don't do that. So I said I was going to demo the basic database thing, raw SQLite on multi-platform. But then, a week and change ago, I was sort of talking to Alec from Square. It turns out that they're rewriting all of SQLDelight to output Kotlin, and not just Kotlin, but common Kotlin, which means this is what you would call multi-platform ready. However, they were missing an iOS driver for that. Like, they had nothing that could run this stuff on iOS. So tonight's demo is actually going to be SQLDelight in Kotlin Multiplatform running on iOS. You are officially the first people to see this running besides me. Like, even Alec, I just sent him a screenshot. So, get intellectually excited. You will visually not be excited. It is super, super boring, but functional. So, and also, by the way, if you're working off of a snapshot build and your demo is working, don't touch it at 5 o'clock before your talk. So I had this big panic moment when, just a pro tip for the potential or current speakers out there. And that slide is just for speaker notes, because I've got a little, what do you call it, blah, blah, blah. Okay, it's my notes. So, hold on, how do we get out of here? Oh, you can see my notes, that's terrible. See, okay, so first of all, don't live code ever. It just doesn't go well. Actually, when you were up here, I was like, yeah, don't go into presentation mode. It's going to maximize your thing. Don't do it. Don't do it. I pre-resized the text for y'all. So, okay. So, not that this matters, but this is what like the iOS side looks like. And you actually, there's no like MVN repo for the native libraries for Kotlin native. So it's all like directly, paths on your thing. That's something to figure out. You got a bunch of crazy linker stuff here. Don't worry about it. You are going to have at least a general understanding of iOS and just native development with LLVM, kind of. Like, you have to know how linkers work. If you don't, don't do this till 2019. Okay, and then there's expected by here, which is a multi-platform thing. Don't worry about it. This is, if you've ever done SQLDelight, this is SQLDelight definition code. So, you got your SQL, and it kind of works the opposite direction of what we normally do, which is normally we're writing in classes, and then you have to do your SQL, and it generates it. They're actually writing SQL, and it generates the classes. But it's interesting because now it generates, nice Kotlin code, which is cool. It does a bunch of stuff. None of that really matters because I didn't put that in my plan to talk about. So on the iOS side, I just made this little play class, play runtime, and it just does some Doppel stuff that will go away real soon at the top there. And then you click it from Swift, and the Swift calls this, and it does a bunch of stuff. And then in your shared code is your shared database code. So if you've ever worked with the support library database thing, they have a callback for this onCreate and onUpgrade. We have sort of a similar structure that calls into SQLDelight to do that stuff. And then threading in Kotlin native is very different. And I'm just sort of getting my head around it. So did some really weird stuff here. But essentially, we're going to create a database and then insert 15,000 rows 3 times. And then we're going to select 10 and print them out. And then, because Kotlin's cool, we're going to do emoji directly into the strings. And that's all that really is. It's just insert some values. And then we're going to select some values using all this stuff. Maybe. What actually happened was Alec pushed a change to the code that generates the code, and then I did a clean build, and then that straight up stopped working because the code that generated the code was no longer the code that I needed. All right. Don't do it. It's a disaster. It's got some weird type prefixes, but that's essentially the class. In Swift, you're just calling this. It's the interface between Swift and Kotlin native. It was not super great, but it's getting way, 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 way better. I actually have one commit in the Kotlin native thing. It's one line. So I'm officially a committer, which is super fantastic. So we're going to do this. You've already seen the output, so I ruined the surprise. Surprise, I guess. I don't know. Whatever. Where is it? Build succeeded. There we go. Woo! I was also going to show you the memory profiler, and that's why I was going to do the memory thing. You have to understand memory stuff, and then I was like, wait, this is weird. Let me do a clean build, and then that was 5 o'clock, and then nightmare. Everything sucked. All right. Anyway, boom, boom, boom. Select some stuff. It's super fast. It's native code. That's it. Well, with the demo. No. I took more talk, but. So, but yeah, it totally works. I'm amazed. I don't even think we need to do any tests because the emoji goes from code all the way through to the thing. So clearly that works 100% all the time. Yeah, and it does. I mean, it works really fast. That is more than 500,000 rows. It's just I've been adding 15,000 over time. We got to do some benchmarks. That was the word I was looking for. Okay. All right. That's it for the demo. So the future. If you use Kotlin Multiplatform and you want a database library, SQLDelight is definitely going to be it for the foreseeable future. I won't say why, but I am very, very sure, at least right now, that the Google team is not rewriting all of Room. So I think they have that. Whether or not they're going to use our driver or just write something that's much more purpose-built, who knows? We'll see how that goes. Our goal was really to maintain something that was a very similar API without impacting performance. But since Android started, there's a bit of discussion around the Android SQLite API. So we'll see. I/O is getting in the way of everything, but after I/O, we're going to rip out the scaffolding and make this much more of a solid thing. So go from this to this. And then have a legit, supported release, I don't know, sometime in the summer, right? So some Kotlin stuff, I really rewrote this 3 times because I started with all this similar classes that were extensions and doing all the Java shit you normally do. And then it was just kind of kept ripping stuff out. So with name parameters, type aliases, extension functions, and then because with the expect actual between the multi-platform, it really kind of boiled down to some pretty concise code. Let me see. Yeah, so the Android side is 4 files, and a lot of them look like this, which is just type alias, and then you have to just be careful with how you actually do the routing, but it's pretty straightforward. The iOS side does not look like that at all, but it totally works, I promise. This is the Java for the SQLite database definition with a lot of query methods. This is the query method in the Kotlin thing. I'm totally cheating there. There is clearly more methods, but having the default methods and having the nullability stuff on here makes this amazingly more concise. I showed this to Jeff on our team, and he's kind of acting like he understands why this is much better looking, but he totally didn't. I'm I know it looks like a mess, but those question marks really tell you a lot. I guess, I don't know. So, yeah, no, it's pretty cool. And there's a bunch of builders and stuff that you can yank out because you don't need to anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Great. So, and there's also extension functions that let you, the support library was trying to sort of clean up the database interface, and you can just do all that with extension functions. So it's pretty cool. What's coming soon, and not just for this, but in general. So JetBrains has got a serialization lib that's going to be Kotlin native very soon, which is essentially going to do what Gson and Mosi or whatever Jackson, I guess. Sorry, not a fan. So anyway, it's going to be doing that. They have some kind of OO library coming out. Right now, coroutines doesn't have the coroutines extension, as far as I know, in the native land, but that's coming out soon. And then, obviously, there's going to be a database thing going on. I'm almost sure that the Square people are quietly working on a networking thing, and so that's all going to be coming pretty soon, in the next handful of months, right? blockers. Threading is super different. You really have to get your head around that, and memory is not, it's not a garbage collector, so it's a big deal. I don't think it's going to be as big of a deal if you're using the shared code, but it's definitely something you have to be aware of. ID integrations are not really quite there, but it's JetBrains, so if anybody's going to sort that out, it is definitely them. And this is really early, so you'll get stuck on dumb things. Like, I had intended to release something today that you could play with, and then I spent 2 days with a JVM class path issue, not even an iOS thing. So expect to run into some shit. But predictions, end of summer, it's going to be core architectural libraries, what I just mentioned. Oh yeah, I forgot to, the other thing at the bottom says shared preferences. We also have like a shared preferences thing in there too. For what that's worth, we like shared preferences still. So anyway, so end of summer, that stuff's going to be rolling along. I am quite sure that KotlinConf is JetBrains' unofficial, official due date to like really make this reasonably productive to build with. And I think mainstream in 2019. And mainstream does not mean wide adoption. I just mean that you could put it in your thing and not run into a ton of stuff. Adoption, is this going to be a competitor to the other options? Is this really going to take off? I have no idea. I'm super bad at predicting the future, but I think so. That's kind of it. So again, that's my contact info. Nobody ever takes the info down, so I'm going to share something later. By the end of the week, I am absolutely going to post a blog post and some code that you can run. Okay, totally promise. I hate when I give talks and I'm like, yeah, you can't look at it. Yeah, it's this I/O is this also this arbitrary deadline. We are looking for orgs actively that want to start playing with us, and we're trying to knock down doors and find them. And we are also hiring right now, mostly just app stuff. But if this is something that you're secretly super interested in, clearly this is a focus. And so, come talk to me. And we're going to be also, by the way, yeah, like a lot, if you want to follow the blog or the Medium thing, every week, roughly, we're going to be posting what's new and where things are at. But I'm super excited about it, obviously. So that's it. Questions? There's no questions?
What's your favorite color?
Oh, my God. That was well played. All right. I figured so. Just showed you a whole new thing. All right.
How did you fit 10 pounds of awesome in a 5-pound bag?
Shit, I'm out of juice. I got nothing. I don't know. I would love to have a joke back. All right. That's it. Okay, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Oh, okay. What?
What's the best way for people to get involved if they want to help out?
That's a really good question. So the first step, you have to go download, you have to go clone, you can't download the Kotlin native repo, and then they have a couple instructions on how to build. It's only like 3 steps, but one of them takes like an hour and change, so have your charger plugged in or whatever. And then there's a samples directory. So if you, nobody noticed, but in my sample I showed, it was called calculator because I didn't even bother to rename the sample. I just took that and went from there. And when we put out a thing, like take a look, because a lot of it, what's missing now is the majority, especially of new code, really is just finding a sample, obviously, and then seeing what that person did. And that like doesn't exist for a lot of this. So I think the best way to start is Kotlin native repo, and then as soon as anybody starts releasing libraries for this, just go clone that and like try to break it. I mean, it's going to be very easy to break now. It breaks unintentionally, but that's the advice. That's the problem. Like right now, a year from now, there's going to be tons of docs and blog posts. I mean, I bet you there's like 100 people just pre-written blog posts are ready to go, but there's not a lot now. So it would also help to understand iOS development. Like, legit. It's going to be bad.
That's tough.
Hey, Kevin, so I just have a suggestion and an announcement. Suggestion first. If you make a code lab of this, more people will be willing to try it and get involved. And second thing, the announcement, I'll be speaking about Kotlin and Android things in the next Kotlin New York City meetup. So if you want to know about that, please attend to it. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, it's good. The step one is definitely like, I need to, get this wrapped up into something you can even clone and build. There's a lot of moving parts. Like one of the steps in building this is clone Kotlin native, comment out a few lines of the core code because they do some checking that will crash the build. It's not super digestible right now, but yes, I'm with you. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Thank you.